Every winter, a frail old man in a warm brown coat fed split logs into a cast iron stove to keep his small house warm. The coat was frayed at the cuffs and held shut with a single safety pin. To everyone in his quiet Vermont town, he looked like a man who was barely getting by. And for years, no one looked any closer. His name was Ronald Read, and for decades, the people of Brattleboro saw the same modest figure walking our streets. He kept to himself, spoke little, and never seemed to have much at all. Most simply assumed he was a poor old man living out his final years. He drove a small, second-hand car, and he would park it blocks away from wherever he was going just to avoid feeding the meter. To Ronald, no amount of money was ever too small to bother saving. Not a quarter, not a dime. He clipped coupons at his kitchen table and saved every spare cent. He bought his clothes second-hand, repaired what broke, instead of replacing it, and gathered falling branches from the woods to heat his home through the long winters. And at 91 years old, he was still out in the yard in the cold, splitting his own firewood by hand, the same way he always had, season after season. Most mornings, he sat alone at the counter of a local coffee shop, nursing a single small cup and reading a newspaper from front to back. The staff knew him as a kind, frugal regular. Not one of them ever imagined what he was really reading it for. When Ronald Read died in 2014, at the age of 92, the town expected a small and ordinary estate. The lawyer who sat down to settle his affairs expected very little to sort through. Then she opened his accounts. Inside a safe deposit box sat a thick stack of paper stock certificates, hundreds of them, quietly built up over a lifetime. And as the values were added together, one by one, the total just kept climbing and climbing. $8 million. The quiet janitor in the safety pin coat had died one of the wealthiest men in the entire county, and almost no one who knew him had the faintest idea. It made no sense to anyone. Ronald had pumped gas for a living, and then he had swept floors. He never earned a big salary, never inherited a fortune, and never won a single thing in his life. So the whole town was left holding one impossible question. The same one you're probably asking right now. Where on earth does a small town gas station attendant find $8 million? To understand it, you have to go back. Ronald grew up poor in Depression-era Vermont, on a hardscrabble farm where money was always painfully tight. From the very beginning, he learned to make do with almost nothing. He became the first person in his family ever to graduate high school, hitchhiking and walking several miles each way to get there, through rain, mud, and Vermont snow. When the war came, he served overseas in North Africa and Italy, and then came home to Brattleboro like so many of his generation, with no money to his name, but a deep willingness to work. He took a job at his brother's gas station, pumping gas and fixing cars for the people of the town, and he stayed there, steady and dependable, for around 25 years. Then, already in his late 50s, he quietly started over, taking a job as a janitor at the local J.C. Penney, sweeping floors and fixing fixtures. He would work there for nearly 17 more years before retiring. There was no pension fortune, no inheritance, no lucky break of any kind. There was only a lifetime of modest paychecks, and one quiet, unremarkable habit that nobody ever noticed. Whenever Ronald had even a few dollars to spare, he did the exact same thing with them, again and again. He bought stock, small pieces of solid dividend-paying companies, and once he bought something, he almost never sold it. That newspaper at the coffee shop counter was the Wall Street Journal. Ronald read it patiently, year after year, teaching himself which companies were steady, profitable, and genuinely built to last for decades. He invested only in what he could actually understand: banks, utilities, railroads, healthcare, and the everyday household brands he watched ordinary people buy and use every single day. He owned pieces of companies like Procter & Gamble, Johnson & Johnson, and General Electric, boring, unglamorous, dependable businesses that simply paid him quietly just to keep holding them. The flashy, fast-moving stocks that everyone else was chasing, he calmly left alone. If he couldn't clearly understand how a company actually made its money, he simply refused to put a dollar into it. He kept the actual paper certificates locked away in a safe deposit box down at the bank. To Ronald, these were never just numbers on a screen. They were real, tangible pieces of real companies. And every single time a dividend check arrived in his mailbox, he didn't spend a penny of it. Instead, he turned right around and used it to buy even more shares. Each year, those companies paid him a little bit more. Each year, that money quietly bought him a few more shares. And then those new shares paid him too, over and over and over again. Slowly, almost invisibly, it all compounded and grew. By the end of his life, Ronald owned pieces of around 95 different companies, location, diversified, and almost never touched. The secret was never some brilliant, once-in-a-lifetime stock pick. It was something far simpler than that, and far, far harder for most people to actually do. The secret was time. 50 long years of letting small amounts quietly compound, doubling and then doubling again, until what began as a thin trickle of dividends had slowly swelled into a flood. But living this way had come at a real cost. Ronald had spent decades denying himself nearly every comfort, eating simply and alone, and wearing the same worn-out clothes year after year after year. To some of the people who knew him, he seemed like a lonely man, quietly watching the world from the outside, going without small things he could very clearly afford. And a few of them quietly wondered if he was simply a miser, hoarding his money for its own sake, saving for some rainy day that never actually seemed to come. Yet through all of it, across all those years, he never told a single soul. Not his coworkers, not his neighbors, not even most of his own family had any idea what he had been quietly building. But Ronald wasn't hoarding any of it out of fear. He simply didn't care very much about what money could buy for him, only about what it might one day be able to do for others. When his will was finally read aloud, a stunned town at last understood. He had left more than $1 million to the local hospital that had quietly cared for his community for generations. And he left nearly $5 million more to the public library he had loved and used for his entire life. A single gift large enough to support it for decades to come. It was one of the largest donations either institution had ever received in its history, and it had come from the frugal old man that almost no one had ever thought to notice. His lawyer was stunned. His neighbors were stunned. The quiet man in the safety pin coat had somehow out-invested people who had earned 100 times the income he ever did. All around him, for decades, far richer people had made fortunes and then lost them. To fast cars, bigger houses, and the endless need to look wealthy. Ronald had simply never once played that game. Because in the end, Ronald Read proved the one thing the financial world keeps forgetting. You cannot need a high income to build real lasting wealth. You need patience, discipline, and time. He spent his entire life looking like a man who had absolutely nothing, and yet in the end he had quietly amassed more than almost anyone in his town. And then he gave nearly all of it away,